In this video, I'd like to tell you a story about how I learned Italian in 2 weeks, which isn't really me who did it, it's the flow that did it through me or as me. So it's a story really about how the flow works and how the flow of life that we exist in as a context, right? Because we usually think we exist from here, like this is my life and I'm the one making it happen. And what I'd like to present and invite you to consider in this video with the story of how Italian was learned is that imagine life is not lived from here but from here, and this exists within this, and this is the flow. So the idea is, how does life work when we exist from the flow, not from my own unique egoic perspective, kind of limited perspective, where I think that I'm the one that is in charge of life and I'm responsible to make my life happen and to do things and to learn a language or make money or find a relationship or whatever it is to control my life. So this story is about, it's an example of what happens when we live from here, not just from here. When this surrenders to this and actually ends up being moved by the flow of life itself. Because this is what this channel is about. It's about spiritual flow. It's about recognizing the egoic sense of doership and the pressure that comes with that, and learning to release it into the flow of life, into life's intelligence, and actually discover that it's almost like life or the flow has a mind of its own. So my limited mind surrenders to the greater mind. And therefore what needs to happen ends up happening. In this case, the story I'm gonna share today is how a language was learned simply by surrendering to this flow, because you could say this is what needed to happen and this is what arose. So one day I woke up with this impulse that I have to learn Italian. And for the next 2 weeks, I've spent like 5-10 hours every day doing nothing else but learning Italian, almost like immersing myself within Italian. Now, as a background to this story is that, for the last few years, 5-6 years, I've been in a kind of transition. I used to be a relationship coach, and then I had a long-term relationship, and maybe 6 years ago I let them both go because they no longer felt aligned for me. So I felt the impulse to focus more on the spiritual process that I was going through, and still am, you could say. And for the last few years, 5-6 years, I've been in this process of learning to be moved by the Tao versus trying to make life happen as an egoic subject, you could say, or as the one in charge. So I could say I've been in this transition from ego to Tao. So from I'm the doer to life is the doer. Life makes me happen. Life does me. And the process of transition is really about surrender, recognizing the mind and surrendering. So recognizing the mind and the fears and the need to control life, and surrendering it to the flow, and actually discovering that actually life knows how to take care of itself. And again, what needs to happen happens. So during these years, I was single, and I lived a few months in Italy, where my father lives with his family, and a few months in Spain, where my mother lives with my younger brother, and a few months in Romania, where my parents have an apartment here. I grew up here. During high school, I went to high school in Romania. And so for the last few years, I've been kind of doing a circuit, a few months in Italy, a few months in Spain, a few months in Romania, and I did that a few times, right, for a few years. And originally, I'm from Moldova. I grew up there. until I was 15 or 16, 15, I think. And then we moved to Spain for a year, and then we came back to Romania for my high school, and then I went to Denmark for my university. And then, I lived in different countries as well with my ex-partner. So, I say all that because it's kind of contextual to language learning, because I already speak a few languages, and I kind of like languages, but I didn't expect I was going to learn Italian. So maybe a year ago, when this story happened, my learning of Italian, I was in Italy, and like I said, by that time I was going to Italy to stay with my father for a few months, 2-3 times already, and Italian is a beautiful language, but I never thought that I would actually learn it, because actually to my ear, Italian sounded weird. It sounded like a strange version of Romanian or Spanish. It was just strange. It was much shorter, a different pronunciation, and I never really thought that I would learn Italian, because when I was in Italy, when I was going to Italy, I usually speak in English, and I never had any problems. So one morning while I was in Italy, I wake up. And again, during this period, I'm learning to completely live in the flow. So I'm not forcing or using effort to make life happen. And this beautiful morning, I wake up, I think a bit too early, at 6 a.m. I couldn't sleep, and the first thought that comes to mind is, I need to learn Italian. I want to learn Italian. So I pull up my phone, and I go on YouTube, and I start watching some videos about Italian. And I end up spending the next 10 hours, so the whole day, immersed in Italian. It's crazy, because I felt like a hunger, like an energetic hunger for Italian, like I was thirsty for it. And I just couldn't get enough. I was watching video after video. And, Italian speakers, Italian kind of language tutors or teachers on YouTube, which there's a lot of them actually, which is amazing. So I was watching those videos, and I was paying attention to the words and to the subtitles and kind of pronunciation and how they are written. So I spent the whole day, the next 10 hours or something, watching videos and really following my intuitive flow of what I was curious about. So for a while, I think I watched videos, and then I started going into the grammar a little bit and looking at the verbs, how they're pronounced, and then I was looking at the numbers and how, trying to learn the numbers, and then I was looking at the days of the week and the month. But the whole day I've spent it immersed in Italian. And, I have experience with being immersed in something, because I've spent 10 years being immersed in spirituality and spiritual materials and non-duality and metaphysics and channeled materials and everything you want in that area. I've been thirsty for that. So most of my days prior to that, I've been immersed in spiritual stuff. Now, suddenly I feel this call out of nowhere and this hunger to be immersed in Italian. So I end up doing that for that day. And then I'm like, that's interesting. It came out of nowhere, and it wasn't an effort. It was just a beautiful flow. And the next day I wake up, and I still have that hunger, and really felt like an energetic hunger or thirst. So I absorb, I ingest, all the Italian that I can. I start listening to podcasts, again, kind of for beginners, but you see, Italian isn't hard for someone like me, because I already speak Romanian as my mother tongue, and I already speak Spanish because I lived in Spain for a year and went to high school there, and I speak some French. So Italian is very similar. The words, I don't need to learn the words. They, per se, of course I do, but they sound familiar already. They just have to be pronounced a certain way, and the prepositions are different, and the endings are different, and kind of the rhythm and the context, the sentence structure can be different. So, I'm saying that I went straight to YouTube and I was watching videos, and then the next day I started listening to podcasts, because you could say had a huge advantage already, because I knew all these other languages, and Italian is a Latin kind of has a Latin foundation. So it was kind of familiar, but still it's a new language. So the next day I still have that hunger, and I keep ingesting everything I can. I keep watching these YouTube videos and paying close attention to how the words are pronounced and different ways of phrasing things and how they're written. And I think by the midday of the second day, I was already trying to copy. I was watching, for example, a 10-minute video, and I was trying to transcribe it. So I was watching the guy speak, and then I was reading the words written, and then I was writing them. So now imagine how much effort, like there's a lot of effort that the mind does in that process. I remember after trying to transcribe a 10-minute video, I was exhausted because I really felt like there was so much mental energy. There was no effort, by the way. Like I didn't feel like I was putting effort, because when something feels right, there's a lot of energy expended, but there's no effort felt. Something feels like effort when we don't actually want to do it, when it's not actually aligned, when it's not part of the flow. So it was not an effort, but there was a lot of energy spent or expended in the process. So for example, I would, from what I remember, after transcribing a 10-minute video, I was like, well, I need a break. So I guess for an hour or two, I did some other things. I went for a walk, but the second day, again, I spent maybe 7, 8, 10 hours, I don't remember, but the whole day, again, immersing myself in Italian. I wasn't speaking yet because, I didn't have the skill to speak, and I think by the second day, I also went online, found it on a website for language teachers, and I found a teacher, and I spent like $40. I got 4 sessions with this Italian girl, and I think the next day, the third day, we had the first call, which wasn't really anything special. It was just a conversation, like a very broken conversation. I was trying to use my broken, like my 2-day skill level to speak in Italian in a very broken way, of course. And she would listen a little bit, she would ask some questions, and she would kind of correct me when I was making some mistakes. And for 1 hour, I was sweating and using my broken Italian with her. So we actually had 4 sessions in total, one every few days, basically. So as you can see, there's a lot of immersion, and actually having her as a quote-unquote teacher became a kind of measure stick and a kind of accountability as well. But it wasn't about accountability, because I wasn't trying to learn the language. It was just happening. I was just feeling this thirst. So I spent the next few days, again, immersed constantly in 3rd, 4th, 5th. And I remember watching some years ago, I remember watching a video from a guy who is a Spanish native. I forget his name. He's a YouTuber as well. And he has a video of learning Italian in 7 days. And when I saw it many years ago, I was like, that's curious, that's interesting, that's a cool challenge. And now, as I was going through the process, I was thinking, well, maybe I can learn it as well in 7 days. Like, who knows? But of course, that's just the mind trying to kind of frame what's happening. I wasn't trying to learn the language in 7 days. It was just happening. And I was just kind of thinking that, that would be cool, like to do it in 7 days. But it could have stopped at the 5th day if I didn't have the joy to do it, right? And yet I would wake up every day with this hunger. And one day, even after the first 2 days, before I even talked to the teacher, oh my God, I think by the end of the second day, my brain was hurting. it's a really weird sensation that the brain hurts. It almost like the brain felt like an acidic sensation, like it was like a muscle that is overused. Because I've ingested during those 2 days, I've ingested so much new information, right? So it's like the brain was scrambling to organize it. And then the interesting thing kind of about the process is that after 7 days and even getting to 10 days, because I felt the energy in the end for 2 weeks basically. But it was interesting to watch because I have never learned something well so intensely, but I haven't learned something for a long time, like learned something like a specific skill. I've been immersed in spirituality and so on, but that's a very different thing. Because if you watch non-dual videos specifically, which are about liberation, they're about the mind kind of giving up conceptual knowledge, and it's about kind of unbinding. That's what non-duality is like. It's the contraction of the self and kind of the experience that I know the world, I know life, I know things, I know I have positions, perspectives, and so on. So that's the non-dual spiritual process of liberation, and it's about unbinding. And this few days of learning Italian was about actually using the mind and learning things in a very nice and certain way. So it was a nice change for me to go from trying to give up the mind to actually using the mind. But for a long time, I didn't use the mind this specific way. And it was interesting to watch the process of how when you're learning a new skill from zero basically to hero, in this very intense way, you feel like one day you feel like, oh my God, I'm learning so much. And then the next day you feel like you're the most ignorant person ever, like you know nothing. Because it's kind of like, and then again, the next day you continue, and the next day you feel like, oh my God, after 2-3 days I was thinking, I speak Italian, I know Italian. And of course I had some skill, but I didn't have a fluent Italian at that point. But it felt like, oh my God, I gained so much progress after like 2-3 days, 4 or 5 days or something like that. And then again, I felt like, no, I know nothing. And then again, oh my God, I speak Italian, and no, I know nothing. So it was interesting to watch this process as well. I think it's a normal process of learning anything. It's kind of like when the brain kind of integrates the information, you feel like, oh my God, I'm really good at this. But then once it integrates it and you keep engaging with the material, you begin to see the shortcomings, the ceiling, the limitations of your current level. And you're like, oh my God, I'm so stupid, I know nothing. And it's so frustrating. So for a few hours or for the next day, you feel like you know nothing. And I remember actually when I being angry, it was like, oh my God, I know nothing. And then the previous day I thought I knew everything. And it very interesting because you see the shortcomings of your current stage of progress, and then you go through it, and then again, you make new progress and you integrate it. It's kind of like the mind integrates it and again feels confident about the process, and then eventually you reach the next level, the next ceiling of where you begin to see the shortcomings. So that was an interesting observation about the learning process in particular. But I guess what I wanted to emphasize as well is that I wasn't trying to use effort to learn the language. I was using energy because, when the things are meant to happen, that's kind of a spiritual conversation we're having now. What needs to happen comes with its own energy to be made happen. Like, for example, if I have to clean the house today, if it's meant to happen, it will come with the energy to do it. Or if I meant to write an article, it comes with the energy to do it. And even this video, because I was quote unquote meant to do it, it came with the energy that it's being used right now to make the video. So it's the same with the language learning. I wasn't using effort because let's say it was meant to happen for whatever reason. I was meant to learn Italian at that point in time. So there came the inspiration, and it came with the energy, kind of with a package of energy. And I was actually monitoring every day, thinking to myself, well, when will this energy run out? Because I wouldn't have done it if there wasn't energy, quote unquote, joy. Like, I didn't feel like doing it anymore. So I did it for first 1 day, second day, third day. I was thinking, well, let's see. If it gets to 7 days, would be cool. If it gets to more, would be interesting, but it may not. And yet, the energy, the thirst, the hunger, you could say, was there for 7 days and then 10 days. And I'm like, I could see kind of it winding down. And I got to basically 2 weeks. And after 2 weeks, it's almost like I was saturated. I was like, no, I'm not interested anymore. I'm done. And I started feeling the energy to go back to my spiritual topics and my spiritual materials and whatever else I'm interested in, right? So it was beautiful to watch how when you move with the flow, with this intuitive current of what wants to happen, there's the energy to do it, and then when the time comes, you begin to feel the energy for something else. And then kind of the other thing that I wanted to point out with this process is that, again, my approach was to do it in an intuitive way, not in a strategic mental way, that I have to do this, or to watch some videos about how to learn Italian. No, I let my intuition be the teacher, be the guide. And I basically did different activities that I felt the energy for and the joy to do in that moment or during that day. So a few things that I did in that case was, to watch YouTube videos, and then again, sometimes when I was watching the videos to pronounce out loud the way the language was spoken. And then, some hours later, let's say some minutes later, I felt the impulse to transcribe videos, and then I felt the impulse to, borrow a book from somebody and read Italian, and then maybe I would go for a walk, and I felt the impulse to listen to a podcast, and then I would have the impulse to kind of pause it and try to kind of think in Italian and try to translate things, use translator to find the right words, to kind of try to think through. And then I felt the impulse to write an article. I wrote it in English, and then I translated it in Italian. So it was an interesting process. And then maybe I felt the impulse to look at the verbs and kind of the conjugation. So I wasn't doing it in any strategic way. It was just the flow, learning Italian through me. And I was only just going with the flow. So I'm telling this story as kind of an example of how life has a mind of its own, and when you surrender to it, it knows how to make things happen actually better and more enjoyably than we could ever do. And, after 2 weeks, I found myself in a bus station at one point, and this older woman comes to the bus station, and she looks at me and she says something in Italian, and I understand it. She asks if the bus has arrived, and I look at her and I reply in Italian. I say, no, ancora non è arrivato il bus. And then I realize, wow, because I speak Italian, and I understood it and I spoke it, because it's almost like my identity, my memory hasn't yet updated in such a short time to my previous identity, which didn't speak Italian, and my current identity, which actually had Italian. So let me give you an example of how Italian sounds. Posso dire che ho imparato l'italiano in 2 settimane di una forma molto intensa, studiando 5, forse 10 ore ogni giorno. Ma per me non è talmente difficile imparare italiano, perché l'italiano è molto simile al rumeno e anche allo spagnolo e io già posso parlare quelle due lingue, quindi è stato un processo molto bello e interessante per me. So as you can see, my Italian is not perfect, of course, and it's already been a year since that experience, and it's probably gotten a little bit better because I've been watching occasionally different Netflix shows and so on. But even after those 2 weeks, I could say that I was able to speak Italian, maybe at a 60% level. Of course, I had the comprehension that was maybe 95. And at the time, maybe I could speak at a 60% level. Now, maybe I speak at 50, maybe 40%, maybe depends on which, topic and so on. I don't say that I speak perfect Italian, but I could say that it's una buona base. It's a good base, right? Because I just don't use the language. So because I don't use it and I don't feel the need to use it, because I could, for example, use it with ChatGPT, but I don't feel the need to do it, and therefore, it's not relevant. So now, to zoom out a little bit, I'm telling this story because it's not about me learning a language, it's really about how the flow learns a language when you're surrendering to it. And that's what this channel is about. That's what I'm passionate about. I'm passionate about spirituality and recognizing that we live in this spiritual flow and actually experiencing it and experimenting with it. And over the last 5-6 years, since I've been living like that, I've been observing how actually life does take care of itself. That you don't actually need to feel the pressure to make life happen and the pressure that you are in charge of your life, and you can actually begin to recognize that pressure and surrender it to the flow and let yourself be moved and be lived. And learning this language is just one example of how the flow does what needs to do. And I've had many other examples. Like, for example, I started a Substack, maybe 2 years ago, also out of nowhere. Suddenly I wrote an article and I started, and then the next day I had the inspiration to write a second one and a third one. And for the last 1.5 years, I've been writing this Substack, and I wrote like 140 articles out of nowhere and using absolutely no effort. So how can a project come out of nowhere? Like, just emerge, right? It was again, the Substack as well was another example of how when something is relevant, it comes with its own energy and just emerges, just happens. And of course, the language learning was for 2 weeks in my case, and the Substack has been for like 1.5 years, and I'm not sure that there's actually, I might have arrived at that 2-week limit with the Substack. I don't know. I feel like I'm kind of complete with it after 1.5 years and 140 articles, which have been amazing to kind of clarify my thinking about creativity and emergence and going with the flow and moving from egoic life to spiritual Tao-led life. So over the last 6 years, I've noticed different things kind of just happen by themselves. And the language learning is just one example. The Substack is another one. I could give another example of the running. Because, of course, when someone introduces this idea of going with the flow versus making life happen with effort and strategy and mind and kind of feeling like you're in charge, you may or may not think that this applies to your exercise, your kind of physical life. And of course it does. I generally exercise just for kind of maintenance purposes these days, but maybe 2 years ago I had, and I'm dealing with some chronic health issues that kind of make me very weak, or not very, but more weak than I used to be. So that's a whole topic in itself. But maybe 2 years ago, I found myself, another example of the flow, I found myself moved to run. And again, without any effort, I kept going for runs for maybe 2 months. I went to the stadium here in the little city of Iași, where I live now. And I went there for like 12 times. And I kept exercising, which was very interesting to observe. Every 2-3 days, I kept going for a run. And I went from beginner to, I think one of the times I run like 17 kilometers in one time. So there was a beautiful progress, and it was a beautiful experience, and it was very aligned for my lifestyle. And I would listen to an audiobook or a podcast while I was running. So that's another story, an example of how something happens within the flow, by the flow, and it's perfectly aligned and relevant at that time. And of course, even now I go for runs occasionally, but not as consistently as I used to, during those two months, because it's probably just not relevant for it to happen. And probably the last example I'm going to give you of how things do happen just when you surrender to the flow, my memoir, my spiritual memoir, If I Knew I Wouldn't Worry, that I've shown it to you a few times in a few videos. So this book, If I Knew I Wouldn't Worry. Also, it got written 5 years ago in 2020 during COVID, just out of nowhere. One day I just, this initial phrase of, so we moved to America, I think what was the phrase? So we moved to America, but who cares? What can a change of scenery do for my soul? That was the phrase that came to me. And I pulled my laptop and I wrote that phrase and the whole story, because the memoir is about me and my ex-partner, my previous wife. We were like 9 years together. We moved to America for her chef internship and cooking internship. And we stayed there for 6 months, and we had different kind of challenges there, which, again, by trusting the flow, solved themselves. We found the perfect house, we found the perfect car. I made the money for the expenses to live there in a nice and enjoyable way. And during my experience in the US, I learned to trust the flow and surrender to it and to follow my joy, right? So if you trust life, then you have nothing else to do than to do what feels right. So that story was so fascinating and inspiring that when I came back, I kept telling the story, and people kept saying, well, that's a nice story, that's amazing. This could be a book, this could be a movie. And it's almost like that story of this book was gestating inside of me and maturing. And then I never thought that I would actually write a memoir. I wasn't even familiar with the structure of a memoir or the category of memoir writing, right? But suddenly, it's like this story was maturing inside of me, and when the fruit is ripe, it falls from the tree. So suddenly I found myself moved to, this phrase came to me, I got my laptop, I wrote it, and the whole chapter, the whole first chapter just, poured out like a faucet, you could say. And I could see that. And the next day, maybe I spent half an hour, and the second chapter poured out, and the next day, the third chapter poured out. And I spent the next 3 weeks with the book, going to different coffee shops for 1 hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, sometimes to 1, 2, even 3 coffee shops during that day. And for the next 3 weeks, I've just poured out the whole story, the whole American story, which again includes also the spiritual philosophy of trusting life and becoming a secure being versus an insecure one. a secure being who trusts life enough to follow their joy. So the book writing is another example of how things happen by themselves. You don't have to make them happen. I'm actually reminded now of a literature Nobel Prize winner from a few years ago, I think. I think he's from Scandinavia or somewhere there. And there's a quote on the Nobel YouTube channel that he said that he's not writing his books, he's just transcribing them. It's like ideas come and he's just transcribing them. And it's another example of how, of course, many artists are in tune with the flow, because otherwise it's very difficult to make art. And here's another example. And it felt the same way with this book. Once the process got started, my mind kept kind of jumping to different points of the story and thinking, I can't wait to get there. I can't wait to get to that part of the story. I can't wait to get to the dream I had on my way to Los Angeles. I can't wait to get to, to that specific part. And it kind of unfolded beautifully. And the whole book was written in 3 weeks. And then maybe a week or 2 weeks later, even I started writing the script for even a TV show, which is still there. I wrote 8 episodes of a potential TV show, which of course, it's still, who knows if it's going to happen. Probably not. But again, without knowing anything about script writing, I just pulled out the computer and I started writing, whatever initial, I don't even remember the structure. I think I've seen just an example of a structure I downloaded it from Google and I started using it to write a script for the first episode, second, third, fourth. And it just poured out. So anyway, these are just a few examples from my life that are meant to challenge the idea that I'm the one in charge, the ego is in charge, and I have to make life happen. And actually, no, when you develop spiritually, you come to a point where it's kind of like the waters of the ocean or the sea reach the land, and the waters are the self or the psyche or the ego, and it begins to reach the land and give way to the land. And it's like the ego becomes transparent enough to let go and let life move it. And in my life, these are a few examples where this idea is being confirmed that you don't need to make things happen. They happen by themselves when their time has come, when the time is right. So when the time was right, I wrote this memoir. When the time was right, I went for these runs, which made sense in a consistent way at the time. When the time was right, I started the Substack, and it poured out for the next 1.5 years until now. When the time was right, I learned Italian, and all of them without using any effort. And kind of that's why I'm sharing the story, is that life doesn't require effort. It just requires, you could say, joy or ease or surrender. And I hope this story kind of points in that direction and affirms the possibility that you can trust life and you can surrender to it and be lived and be moved.